Welcome back, my lovelies. I hope you're all having a fantastic week. It's a slightly greasy haired Sim here today. I was supposed to wash my hair this morning but kind of woke up a bit too late, so we move, right? Today we are focusing on the second video in this assessment center series, and that's the dreaded case study interview. Before we go into the main body of the video, I want to put you guys on a resource that would really help you with your assessment centers. This resource is called the Commercial Law Assessment Center Guide, produced and made by Mindfull Learning. Check their website out via the link in my description. Let me tell you a little bit about them and their guide that they've produced. Mindfull Learning is an educational support company that provides bespoke, unique services and products to individuals that are attracted to city careers like consultancy, investment banking, and commercial law. So for aspiring solicitors specifically, they can provide one-to-one coaching sessions on things like the Watson-Glaser test, application masterclasses, cover letter CV reviews, and interview coaching. Of course, I had to treat you guys with a little discount, so if you enter the code SIMS35 at the checkout, you will get an exclusive 35% discount on two of the most valuable resources that Mindfull Learning has produced. Firstly, the one that I've named the Assessment Center Guide, and secondly, the Commercial Law Applications Guide. Both of these guides have the contributions of over 200 future trainees who work at various international law firms. So this can really highly increase your chances of securing a training contract at a top law firm. Let me tell you guys a bit about the Assessment Center Guide itself. Of course, I want to provide you as much information as I can about this before you make the decision to buy the guide itself. Of course, listening to my Assessment Center series on YouTube is great, but you've got to remember that these are only my views. The Assessment Center Guide, on the other hand, has interviewed over 100 future trainees from various international, national, and regional law firms to create a fully comprehensive assessment center guide. So in this guide, there's over 100 pages with 10 different chapters on things like how to prepare for an assessment center, how to effectively research a firm before an assessment center. There's an assessment center checklist in the book as well. There's over 80 interview questions and an additional 35 exemplar responses, which is written by trainee solicitors themselves. So these kind of interview questions that have been mentioned cover things like competency questions, motivational questions, technical interviews, and scenario-based questions. In respect to case studies specifically, this guide also includes how to approach case study interviews and includes 2 sample case studies and a full case study analysis. So then it kind of prepares you for what may come up in the actual case study interview. Other really useful things that are involved in this assessment center guide are things like how to approach and analyze financial statements, how to approach presentations, how to approach group tasks, and 19 end of interview questions to ask your interviewer at the end. I always recommend asking questions at the end of an interview. It shows engagement, it shows interest, and it leaves a good impression. So, in summary, it's a fantastic resource and I've provided you a fantastic discount. SIMS35 at the checkout for an exclusive 35% discount. Check out the link in the description right now. Right, let's get to the main body of this video now. You know me, guys, I love a bit of structure in my videos, so in this one I've structured it into 2 parts. Firstly, how to prepare for case study interviews, and secondly, how to perform best in the actual case study interview itself. So let's talk about that first section, how to prepare for a case study interview. So in order to prepare, one thing that I like to ask myself is, what exactly are law firms assessing us on when they do case study interviews? Why do they even do them in the first place? Why not do a normal interview? With a case study interview, the reason why they're different to normal interviews is a lot of the time you are presented with a document or an article or even a bundle of documents, even a contract, for example, and you are asked questions based on what you've read. One thing that a law firm could be assessing you on is your commercial awareness. So a common one that I've always faced when I had case study interviews was I was presented with an article, given a limited time to read through the contents of it, and then a partner and an associate, usually it may be 2 people, it may be one person. They'll come in and they will ask you a couple of questions on what you've read and your thoughts on a couple of things based on the article itself. One article that I've received in the past, for example, was about a Big Four firm that was fined for their auditing. And this is where my commercial awareness really came in hand. Not only was I expected to analyse the contents of this article, but my wider understanding of how Big Four firms operated and other recent stories around the Big Four really did come into play in this case study interview. So because I was quite well versed on the Big Four, I've worked for a couple of the firms before, and I've also kept up with the stories on how they've been saturating the legal market, I was able to incorporate these views into my interview, and this really impress the interviewers. In case study interviews, expect to be challenged. Interviewers will be looking to push your point, trying to make you go into more detail on why you think a certain way. And if you have a wider understanding of the topic at hand, like I did here with the Big Four, that really came into play when I was answering these challenging questions. So do bear in mind the questions that you'll be asked if you are presented an article in front of you usually go beyond what the article is saying. For example, you could be presented an article from the Financial Times about a particular company, and then your interviewer may ask you questions like, if given the choice, should we approach this company to be our client? Or, if this company was our client, what advice would we give to them? And how could we add value to them as a firm? So this kind of question not only goes beyond what the article says, it's asking you to have some kind of knowledge about the firm itself and about the wider topic about what's going on in that same sector of the company, for example. So a tip to prepare for your case study interview is to keep commercially aware. And by this I mean not only reading loads and loads and loads of articles, but actually analysing what you've read, thinking about the bigger picture. Some of my previous videos about the SWOT analysis and the pestle analysis can really help with this. Another thing that law firms are assessing is your logical thinking and your analytical skills when you are presented with such documents. Once, when I was presented with that same Big Four article that I've mentioned before, I was tested on my logical thinking skills by being asked whether someone in the article was actually providing an impartial view or not. And here I used my attention to detail skills to pick out that the individual mentioned in that article was the chief of one of the parties involved, and therefore may not have been able to provide an impartial view of the article at hand. And that's the level of detail that law firms expect and interviewers expect from you when you are reading such articles. Another way in which law firms can test your analytical skills is by presenting you with a bundle of documents. Usually these documents are in relation to an M&A transaction, an IPO, or they may be a contract or a lease. So in relation to the former point that I made about M&A transaction documents, make sure you've got a background knowledge of what M&A is all about. You're not expected to have a detailed knowledge of the topic, but having an awareness of the key terminology in M&A is definitely useful. So things like knowing what an SPA is, things like knowing the difference between a warranty and indemnity, knowing about things like undertakings and the difference between a share sale and an asset sale, those are all really useful things and knowledge that you are expected to have in your case study interview and will be useful to bring into your case study interview. So if you are given a bundle of documents that relates to an M&A transaction, it would actually really help you to analyze an SPA in your spare time, look at some common clauses that are usually found. So looking at things like how warranties are drafted in an SPA, how indemnities are drafted in an SPA, looking at things like MAC clauses or entire agreement clauses. Some websites that have really helped me in terms of familiarizing myself with basic contracts or SPAs are things like Practical Law, because they have templates that practitioners typically use. And also, in terms of looking for key terminology in M&A, look at Investopedia. Their definitions are really straightforward. An example that I've had relating to this was to analyze a contract between the bank, which was our client, and a third party, which was an outsourcing company that provides services like receptionists and telephone answering services to big corporations like the bank, who was our client. This contract was several pages long. It was literally a bundle of documents. And some of the questions I was asked based on this contract that I had read beforehand was things like, Can you find the clause that relates to this? Then you would flick through the contract in front of the interviewer and you would identify where that relevant information is. I've simplified this down quite a bit in this video, but the contract is usually quite a vast document and you may not have time to go through every single page in that document within the limited time set. So what I really recommend is having a quick flick through, and the contract may also have a contents page or an index page at the back or at the front to help you guide yourself through the document without having to read every single bit. As mentioned before, I would really recommend looking at template contracts that you can find on Practical Law or by doing a simple Google search. This will help familiarize yourself with the typical structure of contracts. For example, the first page usually has the party names, then the definitions, and then so on and so on. However, other questions that I've been asked usually go beyond the contract itself as well. So an example of such questions that I was asked was, well, what's the advantages of outsourcing these kind of services to another company? Should the client just hire their own receptionists? So this challenges your logical thinking and your actual understanding of what the contract is about. What are the client's objectives and why have they decided to pursue this route? What's the flip side? What would they do if they didn't have this contract at hand? So to prepare yourself for questions like this, when you are looking at template contracts or when you are analyzing certain bundles of documents in your preparation, actually think about, well, if the party was to enter into this contract, why would they do so? What's their objective? What are the potential disadvantages? And if they decide not to enter into this contract, what's the alternatives that they can pursue? Another thing case study interviews try to assess you on is your resilience and your ability to perform under pressure. As I've mentioned before, in a case study interview, prepare to be challenged. Interviewers want to see how you respond to being challenged. Do you get defensive? Do you try to attempt the question? Or do you say, oh, you know what, yeah, I don't know, G, I don't know about this one, it's a sticky one still. So one way I prepared for this is actually having debates with your family and friends. Put yourself in situations where your views are likely to be challenged by other people. Basically start some beef innit. But nah, I'm joking. What I'm essentially saying is, if you know a family member or a friend who has a different political outlook to you or a different outlook on life in general, engage in some friendly but challenging debates with them where your views are likely to be challenged. You could even play devil's advocate with yourself and think about that flip side argument. Try and adopt a view that you may not usually always go with. This is exactly what the case study interviewer is also trying to do when they're interviewing you. They're trying to pick apart your points and actually see your logical reasoning behind your statements. And then when you're having these debates with your friends or your family, also think about and reflect on your own reactions to being challenged. Do you get heated up? Do you get a bit defensive? Does your body language change? Are you starting to stutter? Does your communication style lose a bit of its structure? Because there will be times during this case study interview where you may feel that same way. And this isn't because the interviewer is trying to catch you out. So if you have put yourself in these situations before where your views have been challenged, you are more likely to react calmer in a case study interview when your views are again being challenged. And that can really reflect in your body language, your composure, your communication style. So even though the interviewer may not generally agree with the point that you've made, if they're able to still see that you remain calm, you remain composed, you still remain confident, then that can really go in your way when it comes to handling that pressure when you're a solicitor. And on that note, I think it's perfectly okay if you and the interviewer actually disagree on a point. I've heard sometimes that interviewers actually like it when applicants stand their ground. They don't just let go of their point and be like, you know what, actually you are right with that one. It's okay to accept someone's right at certain points, but also interviewers don't want to see a yes man who's just agreeing with everything that they're saying. They want to engage in an intellectual, engaging conversation. So before we move on to the next section of this video, let me give you some quick fire tips on other things that you can look at to prepare for your case study interview. Firstly, look at the Solicitor's Code of Conduct. Sometimes you can be asked questions on the ethical codes that solicitors have to abide by in your case study interview, so having an awareness of this will really go in your favour. Secondly, I would recommend researching the firm again and consolidating your knowledge of the firm. So look at any recent updates or deals they've been involved in, look at their annual report. From their annual report, look at what their objectives are. Maybe they've got a 5-point plan of where they see themselves going in the next 5 years. That would be really useful to incorporate throughout your assessment centre, not only the case study study interview itself, and looking at information of what makes the firm stand out amongst their competitors. So now this leads on nicely to the next section of this video, and that's how to perform best at a case study interview. So the first point here is one that I've actually touched upon before in this video, and that's if you wholeheartedly agree with a point in the article, you believe it's a reasonable point, and you've got enough evidence to back your point to make sure it's a reasonable point, then stick to your guns and provide more reasoning on why you believe a certain statement that you've made is true. This is because the interviewer would rather see someone who thinks logically and stands by their point rather than someone who's a yes man and eventually concedes to their point of view. Another thing that I've mentioned before in this video is if you are given a big bundle of documents, quickly flick through the documents, try and find a contents page or an index page that will help you guide through the document, and then if you've got more time you can look at certain clauses that you are unfamiliar with in more detail. I've found that those who try to read the whole bundle from top to bottom are those that don't have time at the end and don't understand what the latter parts of that bundle are about. Another point that I'd like to give about how to perform best in case study interviews was something that I did in my first case study interview, and that's don't apologize for not knowing something. In my first case study interviews, I was literally apologizing left, right and center because I couldn't find a certain clause or I couldn't answer a question that the interviewer had asked. I felt like my dumbass was like holding the poor guy up, like he was literally wasting his time. And one point in my feedback was to stop apologizing for not knowing the answer. It shows a lack of confidence and it doesn't actually instill that confidence in the interviewer either. Another point that I would really like to hone in on is to show the interviewer that you have a wider understanding of the topic at hand. If you are presented with an article or a bundle of documents that you have had previous experience in, for example from your work experiences, or you've read a book on, or you've listened to a podcast to, then do try to incorporate a way of bringing in that additional knowledge into your case study interview. For example, sometimes the interviewer at the start of a case study interview will ask a question of, well, how did you find this task overall? And you don't want to be that person who says, oh, you know what, mate, I found it absolutely horrible, like my brain wasn't working. Instead, use this time to talk about what you learnt from the document, and then in that you can incorporate some of the wider things you've read. You can say, well, actually I read another article on this the other day and it linked to it because, and then go into that reasoning. This is one way you can steer the interview to talk about what you want to talk about. So as I mentioned near the start of this video, I was presented with an article about the Big Four, and because I had a wider understanding of the Big Four framework, I actually talked about that near the start of the interview, so the interviewer understood that I had that background knowledge going into the actual main body of the interview itself, and that really impressed him. And then sometimes when you've gone into a bit of detail about how you have that background knowledge already, the interviewer's like, oh my god, no way, like tell me more about that. And again, like I've said, it opens up the conversation for you to talk about what you want to talk about. And during your case study interview itself, make sure that your points are still remain structured, you are still communicating in a clear manner, in a concise manner, and that's really important, especially when you are under the pressures of your points being challenged every single step of the way. At the end of your case study interview, make sure you ask questions. Usually your case study interview is with a partner or an associate, someone quite senior in the firm, and that's one of your opportunities to actually be sitting one-on-one with such an individual rather than seeing them at a networking event and you're literally fighting with other students to try and get your question in. So make sure you ask those questions that you've always wanted to ask someone quite high up in a firm. Things like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Why did you move to this firm after your training? Or if you've trained here, what did you like about this firm? These questions can be related to the case study at hand, but also more about them and their role. It shows real engagement and real interest into the firm and its individuals. Right, well, I'm now going to make a cuppa after this video. I feel like I have really shared some gems here, so thank you for watching all the way through. See you guys in the next one.